Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and together with my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight, we're going to be nice and chatting-like about The Banshees of Inisherin, directed by Martin McDonagh. And that's how far my Irish goes.
It does so.
If I could pull off a different accent, I would have done so a long time ago.
Yeah, I'll try to stay away from any imitation of the Irish accents in this. It does kind of infect you, though, as you're watching it. You kind of like want to pick up some of the terms.
Anyways, before we begin, I want to mention that Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula, you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early, and you'll also get access to bonus episodes. Go to nebula.tv/cinema of meaning or follow the link in the show notes to learn more. Okay, so The Banshees of Inisherin, it just released here, so I'm still going on my first impression. I just saw it for the first time a few days ago. You have seen it twice now, right?
That's right, yes.
You had it on your best of the year list. You also came on to my video to tell me why it should have been on mine as well, or it would have been on mine as well if I had the chance to see it. What are your thoughts on The Banshees of Inisherin? What made this movie so special for you?
You know, going into it, my first impression was I was just excited to see Martin McDonagh pairing back up with Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson. We talked about In Bruges on this podcast early on, and that's a movie that we both have enjoyed. So just the prospect of this film was exciting. It kind of surprised me in watching it. It's a kind of a different movie than I imagined. It is funny. You know, the performances are great. The dialogue is very well written and engaging in the way you kind of expect from Martin McDonagh. But it also is kind of slow and melancholy and really allows the Irish landscape to kind of seep into the movie, and all while it's exploring this kind of absurd, darkly humorous story, but also, you know, a story that's a much deeper exploration of where we find meaning in life and what it means to be a nice person, how meaningful art is. It touches on all these different questions, sources of conflict. There's a lot going on in this movie. So watching it the first time, I enjoyed it a lot. But I think watching it a second time, it opened up even further for me. Yeah, there's a lot here. This is a movie I don't feel like I have a good handle on thematically necessarily exactly what it's saying, but it's a movie that inspires a lot of questions for me as I'm watching it. It makes me think a lot about not just what's happening in the movie, but the way those things relate to contemporary life. So yeah, I'm excited to discuss that with you.
I was going to ask, what was your biggest revelation on the second viewing?
We're getting into spoiler territories pretty quickly, but one of the things that I noticed so much watching it again was how much is happening in the performances. It's a very slowly paced film, which I really enjoy. It kind of takes on the pace of island life, it feels like. The kind of amount of time that happens between certain lines feels just like very drawn out. There's this kind of repetition of certain lines. It just takes its time. But what's interesting is kind of what's happening in the performances, I think, in that space. I think the performance that really opened up to me second watch was Carrie Condon's as Siobhan. And the first time through, you know, I think you see a little bit of the conflict with her character, or I did. But I think knowing her arc going in the second time, her relationship to Brendan Gleeson's character, Culm, I think is really interesting, where there's this reflection in her performance where you start to get this feeling that she actually really understands his struggle. There's a commonality between them. The kind of the point that he's trying to make, quote unquote, she really gets, I think. And it's part of why she decides to leave. Like kind of what he's expressing is part of her impetus for leaving. So anyway, we can get to that later because that, you know, there's more to discuss before we get there. Yeah. But I think that's a layer that I didn't pick up on at all the first time through, but that I really felt the presence of watching again. There's probably more than that, but that's the main example.
Yeah, for me, so I just watched it a few days ago. I really liked it on first impression. I loved the landscapes, the cinematography, the music. It reminded me of Malik's Days of Heaven a little bit, like a movie that's very much tied to a specific location, which is always like bathed in this beautiful light. And that is something that I always really enjoy for obvious reasons, I think. But I was struggling a little bit with how this movie made me feel towards the end. Like, and that's not a critique of the film, but I think I went in with different expectations, or it felt like the movie was setting up something that I recognized and associated with a certain story structure, and then it kind of went in a different direction.
Sure.
So I'm kind of still in the process of figuring out, trying to meet the movie on its own terms instead of, and kind of deconstructing my own expectations that I had of it. Because, to put it shortly, to me it felt more tragic than I was anticipating. I kind of felt sad at the end in a way that I wasn't enjoying, but that may have been to the movie's credit, that it genuinely makes you feel sad towards the end. You want them to be friends, or at least to be happy, and you don't want there to be any conflict, and it still somehow finds them anyways, and it kind of ends on that note also, with a slight silver lining. But I guess it says something about the way the movie connects you to the characters and to their relationships, and that you really want it to work out, but then the movie also doesn't exactly give you that. And at first I thought with Colin Farrell's character, Patrick, I think he was called.
Yeah, Patrick.
I thought he was going to be more of this flat arc type of character, someone like, I think he was called Desmond in the guy from Hacksaw Ridge, or, a movie like Paddington, where you have this one character who's very friendly and kind, and they kind of stay the same throughout the story, and it's the world around them that changes.
Right.
But here it felt like, I thought Colin Farrell or Patrick was going to be a similar type of character, that his kindness was going to be this stable, like, cornerstone throughout the movie. And to some extent it does, but there is a sort of decline or diminishment to his goodness towards the end, which I wasn't sure what to make of at first.
Yeah.
Again, that's not a critique of the movie. This is kind of me coming to terms with my own expectations of it.
I'll interject here because I have something to say related to that I think is maybe an interesting jumping off point for some of the discussion. Maybe what I should have said when you asked what changed the second time around is something that's probably a little more relevant to the story as a whole, or the main arc. But the first time around, I was very much sided with Podrick. You're like, oh, Colum's being absurd. He's making this crazy. I mean, we've already in spoiler territory, so I'm assuming people who are listening to this have watched it already. But the movie kicks off with these two best friends, and Colum, played by Brendan Gleeson, is like, I don't like you anymore. If you don't stop talking to me, I'm going to cut my fingers off, basically. And it just kind of proceeds from there. And so I think you side with Podrick because you're like, that's crazy. Why is he doing that? There's no reason to it. I'm not really defending Colum. I think all those things are true. I think he is being mean, and I think he is acting in sort of an absurd manner. But the second time through, I really found myself questioning like Podrick's niceness a lot more, where everybody's like, oh, Podrick, you're nice. Like, and he says, I'm nice. But we don't actually see a whole lot of niceness. I think the movie maybe wants you to question a little bit the nature of his niceness and whether or not he really is nice. Because pretty early on in the movie, that initial conflict hits, and then he kind of starts being mean to, a little bit mean to his sister, who wants to like hang out with him, and he's kind of brushing her off. And he immediately becomes very like obsessed with this conflict that's happening between him and Colum, and he doesn't really have time to actually engage with what's going on with any of the people around him. And he also is a character that seems very much to overlook certain aspects of the people around him's pain or hurt. And I think this becomes like central to the conflict later. So anyway, I think he does do kind things, like he, welcomes Dominic into their house. There's gestures at certain times that show kindness, and I think like in his heart he has kind intentions. But I have a broader question of like, is he actually substantially kinder than the other characters in a way that warrants the kind of way he staked his identity on that? That was something that I was more present to me, I think, watching the second time.
Yeah, I had some of those thoughts as well, especially when Patrick started really to self-identify as a nice person, which to me seemed like a red flag. When someone has to emphasize for themselves something about their character, then that usually means that it doesn't come out naturally. So that there might be some falseness or like performance there. I also definitely felt that he was a bit dim-witted, maybe. He was obviously not the most clever guy, the most educated guy. He's constantly shown as struggling with language. He wants to say things, but then he just cannot seem to think of anything to say. So it's when Colm finishes his song, he's like, "Oh, that's great! It's not just great; it's very great." And I love that there's something very endearing about his character when he's trying to prove himself in that sense. But I also felt kind of that lack of intelligence also extended to his social awareness, and where he obviously, I can imagine that Colm might have been trying to not necessarily break his relation, but maybe kind of ease away from that friendship for a longer time preceding the movie. Because it does seem like Colm is just from one day to the next, he's like, okay, now I want nothing to do with you anymore. But that's kind of being told to us from
the beginning,
Patrick's perspective also. So there might be, we don't know what happens before that. And we see it with Patrick's sister as well, that she's clearly struggling for a long period of time with what she wants to do with her life. But the moment Patrick finds out about it, to him, it kind of comes out of nowhere, because he's just been kind of insensitive or non-perceptive towards her deeper or those more complex emotional struggles. As for Colm, I feel like he was within his right to not maintain a relation that he has no interest in, or that he seeks or finds no value in. I think everyone's had experiences like that, where when you have someone in your life that isn't necessarily, that you don't necessarily want to be there, and kind of the struggle of how do I casually maneuver my way out of this. So in that sense, I did understand where Colm was coming from to some extent. He obviously goes into these extreme absurdities with threatening to cut off his fingers and then actually doing so. And there's even a cruelty in that act, because he's cutting off he wants to cut Patrick out of his life so that he can make music, because he feels like music is the thing that lasts, or art. And so he wants to keep doing the music, but then at the same time, he threatens to cut off the hands or the fingers that he uses to play the violin. So it's not just that he wants to set like the stakes or set high stakes for Patrick, but there's also a kind of cruelty in the sense that if Patrick does maintain that relation or does keep bothering him, then he's not just hurting Colm physically, but he's also kind of destroying his legacy. So he's kind of placing this double burden on Patrick, which might have been a bad move, because Patrick
doesn't understand it.
He's not sensitive enough to kind of think through the implications of that, or in the way that Colm intended it. It felt like he wanted to do this as some grand, like poetic maneuver, and then Patrick, it just went completely over his head.
There's also such a symbolic like absurdity in that act too, where that I think is interesting, where Colm is like, I'm doing this for a very specific reason, which is I want the legacy of my music to live on, while simultaneously trying to destroy the thing that would allow that to happen in order to accomplish that goal. I see both characters as kind of equally engaging with the absurdity. Like the absurdity of setting up that conflict in the first place rests on Culm, and then like Podrick's seeming inability to like understand the basic dynamic of the situation, which is that what Culm actually wants is to be left alone. Like possibly until the end, kind of the end scene, which we can talk about later, he never seems to really actually understand what Culm wants. So I think there's a really interesting like disconnect there between Culm being this person who has he's struggling with like despair and this like existential dread and all this deep, depression. He's not healthy. It seems like he has this friend who is like unable to engage with like emotional pain of the people who are around him. His sister, Culm, probably the person he most connects with is Dominic. It feels like he doesn't really, to borrow a term from James Cameron, he's not seeing, there's no I see you moment between Podrick and the characters he's around. And like, if you're in that situation, it can be that can be a like painful situation to be in. Like if you're struggling with these deep things and the people around you just seem like fundamentally to not understand that. So I don't know. I'm very interested with how it explores that, and I think on a second watch, I didn't feel like there was an obvious good guy here necessarily in the way that I did maybe the first time.
I thought also that it might have had something to do with, because it takes place during the Irish Civil War.
Yes.
Just like as the conflict on this little island goes on, there's fighting going on the mainland. We see the occasional like faraway cannon fire or gunshots. How much do you know about the Irish Civil War? Like at first I thought, is this some kind of allegory? Maybe I didn't think it was. I don't think it's allegorical in the sense that Colin Farrell represents the one side, Cole maybe the other, right. And this movie explores that conflict. I think that diminishes the depth of the individual psychologies of these characters by reducing them to the kind of general sentiment of a party involved in a war. But it does feel like it symbolically is a form of microcosm of two friends who sort of clash over nothing, or maybe to one party over nothing, to the other maybe over some kind of feeling of misunderstanding, and almost because it kind of escalates by accident. To some extent, Colm obviously escalates extremely by cutting off his own fingers, but then, we're into spoilers, but at some point he throws the fingers at Patrick's door, and then his donkey, Jenny, eats a few of them and chokes, I think. Anyway, the donkey dies, and that sets off this greater conflict where Patrick is now like, oh, okay, now you killed my donkey, I'm going to set your house on fire, which he does at the end. And so it feels like there's just so much needless ruin and destruction, and I wonder to what extent that reflects the sentiment that McDonagh might have had about the Irish Civil War. I did read like it was a apparently some kind of conflict between the interpretation of their treaty with Great Britain. Like they were independent, but one party felt like it wasn't a true independence. And also in the Civil War, apparently more people died than in the actual War of Independence. So they kind of killed more people. They killed more of each other than they were killed by their actual quote unquote enemies in the War of Independence. So it felt like there was a certain sadness there maybe about maybe the Irish Civil War, maybe just even civil wars in general, where at the end of the day you are in conflict with your own countrymen, with your own friends, your own people, again, quote unquote. But yeah, I'm not sure to what extent that metaphor runs, or if it was just a kind of symbolical layer to just kind of add to the texture of the story.
I think, obviously that influence is there. It's a part of the story, but my feeling is, I think you're right that it's not a direct allegory for that necessarily. And not in the sense of, like you said, he's setting up Podrick as one side, Colm as the other. It's maybe more of just a story about the absurdity of certain kinds of conflict and how they can escalate in these ways that maybe don't make a lot of sense, or how conflict kind of can breed conflict. I think there's also parts of it to me that feel like allegorical for more contemporary conflict, like cultural conflict that's happening. And again, there, I don't think you can't like easily map like, oh, Podrick is, the progressives and Colm is Republicans or something. It doesn't map that clearly, but I think there's layers of commentary there potentially about, just the nature of the conflict that we engage in as a culture, and sort of the futility of that conflict sometimes, and how it's fueled by certain kinds of like misunderstandings or inabilities to see other people's experience from their perspective, or things like that. Again, I'm not sure like it's saying things specifically about like, oh, this side, this, that, etc. But it's more just about like the feeling and the nature of conflict itself and how it arises, and how, you can have this one inciting incident of one person going, don't talk to me or I'm going to cut my fingers off. And that just kind of can set in motion this thing that spirals out of control, and there's no really coming back from, potentially. It is possible that the movie is commenting more directly on the Irish Civil War, and, you just don't have the cultural context to understand exactly what those comments are.
I think a more generalized perspective is probably the more relatable, or makes it more relatable to the audience beyond Ireland, which, and I think that's, usually a sign of a good movie, that it has those kind of layers of relatability, that it can be both very specific to people who are in the know, but also to people who might not have the direct cultural associations. They might still relate more conceptually, and then fill in the blanks with experiences of their own, or from their own culture, or just their own point of view. But just kind of to maybe wrap up that train of thought, because that towards the end there's a final conversation between Patrick and Colm about kind of where they're at. Patrick's donkey is dead, Colm's house is burned down, he got to escape though. And there's, I don't remember the exact lines, but it felt like there was both a lack of closure, but also a certain assurance that there's a sort of baseline established, like, okay, this is, because Patrick said, there's some things that you don't move on from. So it does feel like he's saying like, okay, because before that Colm is suggesting like, oh, I think we're quits now, but, or we're even. But Patrick kind of denies that. He says, no, there's no moving on. And he suggests, that conflict is still ongoing and might even escalate beyond that. But as he then walks away, Colm is like, oh, but at least, thank you for taking care of the dog. And then Patrick turns around and he's like, oh yeah, anytime.
Yeah.
And so that to me, I really liked. I was kind of surprised that the movie ended there. Like, I felt like I was in a like full theater, and everyone had kind of this whiplash moment where it was like, wait,
that's it. Yeah.
Is this where it ends? Is it over? On first impression, it does feel like there's a kind of a lack of resolution, or at least there's not a neat little bow tie at the end of it. But after thinking about it some more, I do like that idea that there's at least, it felt like there's some sort of understanding that's being established there, or at least there's a new line that they won't cross, or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how to put it into words, but I don't know. It felt like there was something, even though their friendship was broken and could get worse, there's at least some sort of, some aspect to both of their hearts, or like their dignity, that won't be, that is kind of safeguarded.
Yeah.
But you've seen it twice. You might have a stronger read on that than I have.
My read on that end, something in Colm has been not changed necessarily, but whatever it is about So I'm going to get into maybe exploring, there's half-formed thoughts here. And I want to get into exploring maybe like, I think what a deeper conflict or a deeper theme in this film is that I didn't, there's like, oh, it's about conflict and friendship and art and these things. But there's this like deeper question that's underneath that has to do with what is going on with Colm's character and why is he doing this in the first place, that I think is kind of the key to understanding the movie. And I think a lot of that is about this relationship between niceness, truth, or accuracy is one way it's put at one point. Podrick has a conversation with the old lady.
The ghoul?
The Banshee, I think she is.
Mrs. McCormick? Is that the one?
Oh, yeah, Mrs. O'Royden.
The old sort of witch-like character.
Witch character. Yeah. My theory is that she's the Banshee, but or one of them.
I did not know what a Banshee was, so
I think that's a part of Irish. They have a brief conversation about it. Podrick comes into the house and he talks to Colm, and he says, Colm says he's finished the song, and Podrick says, what's the name? And Colm says it's called the Banshees of Inisherin. And Podrick is like, there are no Banshees on Inisherin. Colm is kind of like, no, or at least none that portend death, and none that scream and portend death. Instead, they kind of just sit back and watch amusedly, which is what Mrs. McCormick does. She's just kind of like skulking in the background. And literally at the end, as that final scene is happening, she's sitting in a rocking chair, like overlooking the whole thing, and just kind of has this, she's very amused throughout most of the movie. So I think she's kind of a stand-in for one of the Banshees. And she just seems to have this like supernatural quality about her.
Yeah. Maybe just for the other dummies like myself, like Wikipedia says that a banshee is a female spirit in Irish folklore who heralds the death of a family member, usually by screaming, wailing, shrieking, or keening.
She literally does predict a death at one point, and she doesn't shriek or scream, but she's kind of the one who finds Dominic when he's dead.
She said too.
She talks about two deaths, I think, and one is the
donkey.
One is one I interpret as being the donkey. The other thing is she is kind of like beckoning. There's that one scene where she's beckoning towards Siobhan, and Siobhan is kind of like, reacting to it. She's like, no. And I think like Siobhan is one of the ones who kind of escapes the Banshees of Inisherin. She gets out. She's grappling with sort of like the existential darkness. She manages to escape, relatively unscathed. The reason I was saying that is at one point she talks to Podrick and she says something, I don't remember exactly what, and Podrick's like, that's not very nice. And she says, I wasn't trying to be nice. I was trying to be accurate. And I think this is a conflict that's kind of, the movie is kind of touching on in several places. And part of what's going on with Colm is that he feels like this sense of niceness is a denial of what he sees as kind of this like deeper truth, this like darker, heavy, existential truth that he wants to engage with, which is like, hey, we're headed for death. He has a conversation about, he and Siobhan have a couple conversations that kind of touch on this theme, but his whole like main monologue about, art, music is meaningful because people remember it, is a part of this, like, he's trying to engage with, I don't want to waste my life. He's grappling with this, like, very deep existential sort of question that's fueled by, like, the inevitability of his death. He kind of sees this, like, this niceness, quote unquote, that Podrick represents or is putting forth as, like, a barrier to actually engaging with those heavier questions, which I think is reflected in Podrick's seeming inability to like engage with the emotional pain of the characters that are around him. So it's setting up some kind of conflict there. But then that is resolved somehow at the end for Colm by Podrick kind of going to the dark side. Like he engages with his own pain and sort of like lashes out a little bit, then that sort of makes him tolerable to Calm for some reason. He's kind of like, oh, I'll stand here and talk to you, and even thank you for caring for my dog. It overcomes something a little bit for him. But then the dark side of that is like Podrick is not wanting to engage in the same way because he's been hurt by this process. So I don't know. That's kind of half formed as kind of an interpretation that I have right now. But that's what was running through my head the second time as it was kind of coming to that conclusion.
I think based on that, I'm not sure how well this fits the actual movie, but based on what you just said, that had me thinking of the work of Ernest Becker. You know, his
I'm not
famous
super
book,
familiar, but I know you've talked about The Denial of Death.
Well-known book, The Denial of Death, that basically posits that human beings are, the fundamental struggle is that struggle with death, and specifically the not just physical death, but also oblivion, like insignificance and death without meaning. And so what he argues is that as an answer to that, we try to engage in symbolical immortality. So in his case, there's multiple ways to go about that, through like love and family, or through a country or some other symbolical ideology, or in the case of Calm, through art. He wants to have his music. He talks about Mozart at some point, mistakes the age he lived in, which is kind of funny. But he talks about Mozart as essentially being immortal because we still remember him now centuries later, and that he sees as a resolution to the problem of death, basically. So in that sense, it feels like that struggle is kind of going on there, that he is coming to terms with the despair of death, and he comes to the resolution that I'm going to overcome this through releasing more of my music into the world. And I think that kind of ties into what you were saying about the way kindness is, in his perception at least, perceived as something that stands in the way of that.
Right.
But then at the same time, what might have been his revelation then at the end is that now he knows, like, he hasn't been nice. He's been like cruel and absurd and destructive to those around him, and it ends up causing all this needless destruction. His house is burned down. He has no fingers left to play music. And so there's a revelation there that that kindness is not so much an obstacle to that kind of transcendence, but it's actually a sort of subtle, quiet facilitator of it, that in a kind world, that's also when things are allowed to blossom and to last.
Yeah.
Because if you kind of rule it out and you end up in this world where everyone's just mean to each other and burns each other's house down, then there's also no space to create and do anything meaningful.
Yeah.
So because there's an argument earlier on that, or an argument that they're having where Patrick is talking about how kindness is also important, and just being nice on a day-to-day level, that's also what matters on that more existential level. And I feel like that maybe towards the end then, Calm has a sort of, comes to an understanding of that, at least in part, that his kindness or his kind of purposeless friendship with Patrick was not what was standing in the way of him being this composer or whatever he wanted to do to fulfill or to overcome his existential dread, but it was maybe something he actually should have cherished and or at least handled in a different way in order to be able to do the other thing. I'm not sure. That's at least my very rough analysis, just based on what you were talking about.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's interesting how we see Calm do some acts of kindness towards Podrick in a couple places, where he kind of stands up for him to the police officer twice, kind of in two different occasions. And then also, there's thinking about what you just said, there's some kind of thematic connection too between like Calm. One of the things that I think really strikes Calm, or kind of is part of his becoming aware, or part of his character shift at the end, is he does really feel bad about Jenny dying, the donkey, which is an accident, but he feels bad about it. He has that conversation with the priest, and the priest is like, God doesn't care about animals. You think God cares about a donkey? Colm is like, I fear that he doesn't. And then immediately after that, Podrick burns down his house, but saves his dog. And there's something in like that gesture, obviously, that touches Colm in a way that I think like kind of transforms his view maybe of Podrick. Because the weird thing is, it's not like Colm doesn't have the ability to tolerate somebody he doesn't like, because he doesn't like the police officer. He kind of despises him for several reasons. He like punches him at least once, but he sits in the pub and like has a conversation with him. He can, quote unquote, tolerate the fool, but for whatever reason, he's got it in his head with Podrick that he can't do that in this specific scenario.
I think that maybe also with his guilt about Jenny is that he realizes that he set out to create something that lasts, and in the meantime, like what he really did was actually destroy something through kind of his inattentiveness or his kind of obsession with destroying that relationship. And so maybe to kind of rephrase what I was saying earlier on about the kind of existential place of kindness, is that there might be a realization there that it's also not so much about trying to create something very important and putting that into the world, but also just at the very baseline, just maintaining it as it is and not making it any worse is also already a sort of something that we take for granted when we talk about existential purpose and leaving a legacy. Just leaving the world not worse than you found it is not something a lot of people genuinely aspire to. We want to leave something more significant, something more important, something that will be talked about. And we kind of forget that just making sure that there will be people in the future or that can talk about stuff might just be as important, or just kind of preserving what we have instead of just feeling the need to add something to it, especially when that means that we have to sacrifice something in the present or just cause something to ruin. To put it like this, especially when we are sacrificing something concrete for the possibility of something that lasts, instead of having two kind of these equal forces.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I have the feeling that McDonagh, doesn't really have a side that he's taking. I think kind of philosophically, the way that Podrick states his side as, oh, my grandmother was nice, I remember her, and kind of his thesis of, hey, it's the way we treat people that matters. Who cares about Mozart or these other guys? I think it is, in a sense, like the better position, but I think you can't confuse sort of that niceness with a blindness to sort of truth and the state of things and the pain that people are experiencing. And so, it's like for that niceness or kindness to be truly meaningful, it can't be ignorant, I guess, is the way I would put it.
Yeah.
Like, if it's just enacted out of a sense of ignorance, then it isn't as deeply meaningful as when it is, in Podrick's case, he, saving the dog as an act of kindness, even in the face of his like deep, like he could have retaliated, like an eye for an eye in that situation, but there's like a recognition of, or there's niceness there in spite of his own pain and in spite of the conflict and in spite of the hurt that was inflicted on him by Colm. It's not just, oh, I'm nice to this guy because he's nice to me. So I don't know, there's something there, and there's a way in which that position kind of has to be tempered by a recognition of sort of like reality and truth and accuracy and these other things. So I guess I say that to say I don't think McDonagh has a position so much as he's taking these two ideas and positioning them in kind of like a dialectical conversation through the film, like in a kind of Socratic dialogue. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing play out.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think it doesn't have to be either or, like that. That's not the real choice that I think is thematically relevant there. It's not for Colm's character, not for Patrick's. Because I feel like too often we talk about that kind of ambition to leave something as in this kind of whiplash style where you have to dedicate your whole life to this single purpose and burn all your relationships. And I feel like maybe that's kind of tempered down a little bit in this movie, but at the same time, there's also not, there's, as you said, there's also kind of an argument against just naively going through life and going through the motions, because, you know, with, if we all just did that, then there wouldn't have been a Mozart, there wouldn't have been that artistic elevation of humanity or the progress that we've made in other areas. So there has to be some balance or some kind of awareness, some kind of deliberateness that I feel like this movie is exploring. Because, yeah, as you said, it doesn't feel like there's a clear victor at the end, or not like a in the literal sense, but also in the moral sense, that there's not someone who has the ends on the moral high note or the high ground, at least not in my perception. And so, yeah,
I agree.
That may also be part of the confusion that I can imagine some people felt at the end, that there wasn't this clear statement as you're used to getting in many other movies, where at the end it's like, oh, I thought I had to be selfish, but now I realize I have to care for other people, and you were right, and I was wrong. Yeah. There isn't exactly that clear of a coming to terms moment or coming to a realization moment, but it ends up being this kind of broader portrait of how these forces interact with people and how they clash with each other. And that's what kind of part of what fascinated me about this movie, but also, it's also an aspect that I'm still struggling with to fully make sense of. But yeah, I guess that may have been the point to some extent, to leave that ambiguous.
I relate. I think I struggled to connect with it emotionally the first time. Like the ending, I didn't know what to do with emotionally. Like I felt a little bit out of touch with the emotions of the movie. But I was more emotionally affected by it the second time around. So, you know, it might have just been the context in which I was watching it. But, you know, not having the expectations and kind of understanding a little bit more what the movie is trying to do allowed me to like get connected to it emotionally a little bit more. There's a couple other questions I have. Yeah. Do you think the masks in Colm's house represent anything super specific? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't remember. I remember the one mask that Patrick kind of plays with as he is exploring the house. There was a lot of woodworking and like little
knickknacks,
artsy projects, it seemed. Didn't really think that much more about it, other than that he was clearly someone who was passionate, or at least engaged in creative arts, hobbies, creating things that last, as he might be nearing the end of his own life. One thing I do want to talk about some more is we've talked about the main characters, his Colm, Patrick, his sister. What were your thoughts on Dominic? All four of them are nominated for an Oscar, by the way.
Yes,
is really cool.
Yeah, all the nominations are deserved. All four of these performances. I mean, the whole cast is great, but all four of those performances, I think, are spot on.
Only Jenny got snubbed, unfortunately.
Yes, only Jenny. There's no lead best animal. Yeah.
The best donkey.
Definitely by far the best donkey in any film. Well, actually, there's EO this year. I haven't seen EO from last year, so maybe.
There might actually be some competition.
Yeah. Dominic, I'm not sure how he relates to kind of like the central themes that we've discussed, besides kind of being an extension of just sort of the like torment and malaise of the island. And, you know, I thought about him a little bit in the context of this story being sort of a reflection or allegory of contemporary society and some of the conflicts in that. He's very much this sort of incel kind of character. Yeah, I use that kind of like in the literal sense. He's tormented by I think a lot of the same pain that everybody else on the island is to some extent. But, he's abused by his father. He doesn't have prospects in life. He's kind of looked down upon as being dim-witted. Love is kind of unattainable for him. He kind of succumbs to the despair that, I think Colm is kind of fighting against in a sense. We don't know exactly what happens to him. There's some comment like, oh, maybe he fell in the lake or whatever, but it seems pretty clear to me that he probably killed himself. So yeah, I don't know. What about you? What did you think of how he fit into the broader narrative?
Yeah. At first I thought he was a kind of extremer progression of Badrick's character, like a sort of character to show in a more extreme form, like in a more extreme reflection of who Badrick is. Like he's actually kind of dim-witted, kind of socially inept. And that at first I thought he was just maybe a way to kind of enlarge our perspective of Badrick or kind of clarify that. Yeah. I think there's an interesting dynamic also between the two where they seem to connect, but at the same time I feel like Badrick was kind of depending on him being lower on the island's social hierarchy than he is, just to make sure that because I think Badrick did realize that if it wasn't for Dominic, then he would be the island dummy, so to say. He would be the bottom of the barrel there. It did kind of his story. He's also in love with Badrick's sister, which is pretty obvious. I think he does have a really great scene where he tries to profess that love and he's rejected, and there's kind of that sad moment where he's like, oh, there goes that dream. And that kind of speaks to, I think, what you said about him also being this character who just kind of longs for some kind of connection but isn't able to find it on the island, not in a like that meaningful, deeper. He mostly seems to just get by with Badrick as long as he can offer him whiskey, and as long as Badrick doesn't have another friend that he'd rather be with. I felt like his story did take a dark turn when it was revealed he wasn't just being like abused, as in like beaten by an overly aggressive father, but also molested by him sexually, which felt like almost needlessly dark. I'm not sure to what extent what that had to do with the story, other than that it revealed how bad of a character his father was.
Right.
Because I'm not sure he might also have a bigger role in the story that we haven't touched on the way he is kind of he's clearly a very corrupt cop who's constantly abusing his authority just to kind of be aggressive towards people he doesn't like.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how else that, in what other ways that ties into the story. But anyways, yeah, for Dominic, that kind of made his story feel like a little bit too real, almost. Instead of, because there's a lot of the conflict in this movie that you can kind of not laugh at, but it always feels like it comes with that kind of typical McDonagh wink, or there's haha, he's going to cut off his fingers. And, it feels kind of, there's an absurdity to it all. And it felt like with Dominic's story that felt, I couldn't see the joke anymore, or I failed to see like the funny side of it. But overall, I did think it was a great performance and a great addition to the cast. I think he did bring an interesting perspective also to the conflict that the others were having. Just to hear his point of view on things was, especially in the way it was acted, with kind of lively, kind of very direct, like someone find it very direct, very unfiltered, which I thought was definitely brought a lot of humor. So yeah. That I did really like.
I think it is a tragedy. We talked about that at the beginning, and when I said I connected with it more emotionally the second time, like the emotion I felt the second time watching it was just sadness. Like it wasn't like, oh, I mean, it's funny. There's some really hilarious lines. Like right towards the end, in the midst of kind of the darkest parts of the movie, there's one of the funniest lines where Siobhan, she's moved off the island. She writes this letter back to Podrick, And she's like, I've ensconced myself in mainland life or whatever. And then Podrick replies and he's like, obviously, I don't know what ensconced means. There's just like a ton of very funny moments and lines. But the story overall, I think, is just purely a tragedy. And I think Dominic, and what you've talked about, for me, part of that is just speaking to this deeper idea of there being just like demons that people are struggling with on the island that are not acknowledged openly or talked about, or really like they're not getting to grapple with them directly in conflict. Instead, that's coming out in other ways, or those people are just falling into despair. So yeah, it's it's dark and tragic, but I think, is it a step too far for maybe a movie that is otherwise so absurd?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it goes too far, but I did like that the cop got punched in the face.
Yes, yeah.
And he is being treated as this kind of foul person, even though they don't even acknowledge or they don't even realize the full depths of it until Podrick kind of blurts it out.
I kind of appreciate it in the sense that I think the movie is wanting to try to really engage with like the depth of hardship that people might experience in life, Inisherin being a microcosm sort of a larger philosophical questions about how we live our lives and conflict and things like this, and our ability to sort of like engage with the people around us and acknowledge what other people are going through and their hardships. I think I see the same thing kind of reflected in Siobhan. It's like there's a lot of so much that she's struggling with that's completely under the surface, completely unacknowledged, that we only see. And Podrick especially is completely unable to even recognize it. And it's eventually what makes her leave. She just has to leave entirely. And I see kind of like Dominic and Siobhan as like mirrors of each other, kind of going in separate directions surrounding the other two characters. Or that's kind of the feeling that I had.
Yeah, I think that in the most general sense, I did feel like it was a very empathetic movie, and one that really inspires empathy, just also by the fact that it's set on this very remote island where there's this just tiny community with people who aren't like something special, they're just regular citizens. And to show that even on that, the kinds of people where we usually assume there isn't that much depth going on, that there's still like this wealth of inner richness and inner conflicts and inner demons going on. That there's just just within that kind of in such a tiny space, there's still this wealth of the grand like human experience. The fullness of the human experience is still represented and still captured in even those remote places where on the surface nothing seems to happen.
Yeah.
It's also it's just the fact that it's kind of completely outside of Ireland itself, because Ireland is at war, but at the same time the island of Inisherin doesn't seem to be bothered with it at all, which again emphasizes that it feels like this kind of vacuum space where there's no connections to the outside world, nothing really happens, nothing of significance happens at least, and still you still find these same basic human struggles. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. This month, that will be Damien Chazelle's Babylon. Before that, we've also covered Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Upstream Color, Alien Covenant, Drive, and many others. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.